Welcome back to my watery grave, where we examine the truly horrific and mysterious stories from across the globe at the fine midnight hour. I would like to start with an apology for my absence. I received a rather deep cut to my throat and was unable to speak without severe pain and a delaying of healing. It still needs to finish scarring, but I can speak without the fear of tearing the wound, so I must tell my story. I stopped in Japan and had a rather interesting visit, but that is for another time. What I found in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, prominently displaying itself amongst the black waves, is tonight's tale. It was a full moon the night I found it. I remember seeing its radiant face glistening off the massive hole. I was stuck in that hellhole for days, maybe even a week, with no food and little sleep. It was horrific. A personal prison of pure torment. Let's get into it. I was around 1,000 miles east of the Philippine Sea, heading towards North America, and I came across what I believed to be an anomaly, whose purpose I do not know, but have personally felt its malicious forces. I do hope I damaged the sub enough to eventually end its evil, but even if it will still live to feast on others, I will find it eventually, and I will destroy it. I guess I should explain what this beast is, so I'll set the scene. It was a standard night with small rolling waves and no other living thing in sight. It was a cloudless sky and the light of the moon dancing off of the waves with beautiful elegance. The only other light came from the ship, however. I had turned my lights to low to appreciate the dark a little more. This could have ended badly if I hadn't heard the extra waves breaking against something. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere farther in front of me, and I shut my engines off to get a better idea of the source of the noise. There was nothing on the radar, but I wanted to make sure, and soon after I did, blood-red light flooded through the windows and filled the bridge. It would have been blinding if it wasn't for the dark color. It was very surprising, as somehow there was something immediately in front of me, where mere moments ago it was only an open ocean. After the light faded, I left the room and went outside, and that's when I saw the conning tower sitting stationary amongst the void. There was a submarine only a few dozen meters in front of me, and it was huge. I could see the top of the hull sitting out of the water, and it was over 100 meters long. I realized I was in a rather precarious situation. Submarines, especially ones this large, are usually never seen, and definitely not just sitting in open waters. They spend the majority of their time underwater, their location completely unknown to everyone except a small few. As impressive and fascinating of a machine as it is, I did not want to be one of those lucky few. When the submarines surface, it's usually to get supplies. If I was discovered during the supply drop, it could lead to serious consequences depending on the country that owns it. I didn't want to be imprisoned for life, so I shut off all my lights and sat for a couple minutes, listening for any noise that would confirm they know my existence. To my pleasant surprise, there was nothing. There were no extra lights, just the occasional red flash. No voices, no other vehicles. I had no idea what was happening, or what the best case scenario is. I should have just left, but once again my curiosity had to get the best of me. I continued to sit for an hour in silence, just watching the water splash on the surface. I decided sometime after that there wasn't going to be a supply drop, but the fact that the sub was sitting there surfaced and alone seemed a bit strange, and I fell straight for the bait. I slowly approached the stationary giant and attached my ship to it. I was going to investigate, and so I grabbed a small waterproof bag and filled it with a water bottle, flashlight, and a knife. I leapt from my ship to the submarine and landed on the flat platform leading to the entrance of the tower. I walked over and felt my way around the walls and felt for the hatch. I slowly opened it and was surprised to see all the lights were on. I stepped inside and sealed the door to my makeshift prison. I climbed down the ladder and found myself in the control room. I expected this to be where I'd find at least some crew, but I was as lonely here as I was amongst the endless ocean expanse. I slowly walked around looking at the different monitors and desks. I felt almost as if I were in a museum walking through a model of a sub. It was very real, but the lack of people made it seem like a ghost town, somehow completely functioning without a single person in sight. I continued on to the next room, stepping through the hatch, and found I was in the reactor room. It was also had machinery transferring the energy to somehow usable by the engine, and I didn't really want to spend too much time around here because I figured the less time I was by the reactor, the less time I had to accidentally mess something up. I went to the door and heard the sound of large machinery operating. Through the window, I saw a darker room full of large pipes curling around, forming an uncomfortable path through the engine. I slowly opened the door, and as it creaked open, the light above the service door at the end of the hall began to flicker, and crash rang out behind me before I stepped inside. I quickly turned to see what caused the noise. There was nothing directly behind me, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing. I needed to now seek out the source, and hopefully it wasn't hostile. I carefully turned to close the engine door room, but was quite struck by the now lack of any light in the room. The lights must have been turned off, which wouldn't have been an issue, but the utter void it created felt sinister. I wanted to immediately slam the door the second I saw this blackness, almost as if the dark itself was an entity to fear. I resisted and stood staring into the room and listening to the continued clanging and roar of machinery. There didn't seem to be anything else out of the order, so I shut the door and continued on my way to find the noise, making sure to pull out my knife first. I climbed down the ladder to the lower level and walked towards the front of the sub. I was approaching the galley, and in there I found what made such a clamor. A handful of plates littered the floor, and so my assumption at the time was it must have just slid off the counter from the rocking. I do not believe that now, and truly think it was the signal of the beginning of my torture. I continued past, maneuvering around the plastic trays. I was concerned with finding the crew of this vessel. I didn't actually believe I was alone in here. For one, a ghost submarine seemed a bit far-fetched, but also more importantly, I felt that uneasy feeling of constant observance. It was as if there was always someone or something lurking around every corner, just lying in wait, waiting for their chance to reveal and descend on their prey. The main problem with that was I was the prey. I knocked that up to the claustrophobia felt being inside a metal tube. I'm so used to being in wide open spaces. Hell, only a few moments ago, I was outside in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. and hadn't seen a single human for days. I was spread out as I possibly could be on Earth, and I found myself ducking through doorways and scooting past booths in the mess hall now. There were still no signs of life, but everything was clear and uniform, except for the plates, that is. I don't mind the cleanliness, but it takes effort to keep things in order like this. There's no dust on the table or chairs. It's spotless, and as I expect from military men. But where were they? I made my way nearly to the front of the sub. I found the bunks, and as expected, there were perfectly made beds, and absolutely nobody to speak for them. It wasn't really what I wanted to see. There weren't many more places I could go check in this place. I thought to myself that there were only places that I hadn't explicitly checked, were the dark engine room, but I counted that one out because I expected if the crew were in there, one of them should have seen me. The last two places had to either be the weapons holding and the food store room. I headed to the weapons first, walking back and climbing the ladder to the main deck. I looked at the engine room, with its continued rumble leaking through the door. I thought about the unstable light flickering alone in that ominous room. I walked away from its presence looking for some other sentient being. I meant any other being. Even if this sub was haunted or something, I just wanted to know what was happening. Why was there this abandoned sub in the middle of the ocean? I was worried that maybe there was some gas leak or that they had evacuated, but there was nothing out of place except for those knocked over plates. There was no odd smell or residue on surfaces. Also, I found it unlikely that the crew would have all escaped, and frustratingly so, there were still no bodies, alive or dead. I made it to the weapons storage, and I don't know if the evil I found came from anywhere specific in the sub, but if it did, it was this room. Setting aside this absurd weapons and mass destruction housed inside, lying in wait to obliterate the world. I speak of paranormal evils that lurk in the dark in hopes of helping to keep this world from plunging into destruction. But the blatant demonstration of weapons we use on ourselves is disgusting. We bomb and destroy for fun, and there isn't a difference between government-sanctioned destruction and the destruction that comes from malicious spirits. Both need to be dealt with. I wish that the worst evil I found in that room were missiles, but after I had fully entered and began looking around, I became aware that something was different. I walked down the aisles of lockers and cases, and I wasn't alone. It wasn't the presence of a crewmate, or even a singular entity for that matter. It was more of, I stepped into a living thing. I felt I had been completely enveloped in it, and the world I stepped into changed the reality somewhat. I was under its control, and it favored torture. I was quite uncomfortable, as if I was being watched from all around, and was being pursued by some invisible man. He was behind furniture, making sure to remain out of sight. Don't be fooled, however, he wasn't scared of me. He was stalking me. He kept his form hidden from my vision simply to wait for the perfect moment to strike. I never stopped moving when I was in that room. I wouldn't let him get too close. I turned out of an aisle to leave the room, but as I looked at the door in front of me, it was as if the ground stretched out, dragging me further away from safety. I began to run towards the door. I didn't think I was going to make it, but I was just fast enough to grab the handle before I was ripped away. I threw the door open and dove through. I got up as fast as I could and slammed the door. I thought to myself it was time to leave and continued away from this detour. I climbed the ladder up to the hatch but found it unopenable. That dark feeling washed over me once again. I jerked my head down, and I could have sworn that just leaving my field of view was an all-black figure. It was a quick flash, and then it was gone. I dropped down and landed quickly scanning the room for my stalker, but found none. I had a death grip on my blade, and I was determined to leave. I had to find this unseen tormentor. I ran down the hall, and I jumped down the ladder to the subfloor. I saw the blur again, but for much longer this time. I was getting closer. It had ran into the food storage, and I followed in quick pursuit. When I entered the room, the freezer door was open. I, obviously not thinking at the time, entered the freezer. It was a trap, and I was now locked inside the cell within a cell. And that cell was cold. I don't know how long I was in that frozen box, but I sat in complete darkness for many hours at least. Towards the end of my imprisonment in that ice box, my vision started failing, somewhat, as the outside fluid of my eyes began to freeze. I kept my eyes closed for the most part, occasionally opening them to see if somehow my environment has changed. I couldn't really tell the difference between when I had my eyes open or closed. It was all blackness. I was in the fetal position next to the door. I had long since stopped trying it, but I decided to give it one last shove into what I can only describe as my most pleasurable surprise. It swung open slowly, and I felt the warmth on my face. I opened my eyes, and the burn of the light was the least of my concerns. I crawled out of the freezer and closed it. I didn't know if the thing let me out, or just expected I was dead and left. But either way, I knew I wasn't safe. I used my blurry vision and frozen fingers to crawl my way to the back corner of the storeroom, near some shelves with boxes on it. I hoped it would give me somewhere to hide while I recovered. I needed some time to figure out what I was going to do. Also, laying there still shivering, I had one thought only, and it was how I was going to open that hatch. I figured I'd have to sneak all the way back to the ladder without it knowing of my presence, and hope it stopped holding the hatch too. I needed some strength to get back to my ship, and possibly fight off an attack. I searched the box above me, blindly rummaging my hand around. I grabbed what felt like a fruit pie, digging my fingers straight into the center. I grabbed a handful and stuffed into my face without even opening my eyes. They still weren't adjusted to the light. When I had tasted what I had placed in my mouth, I knew it wasn't fruit. It was a mushy, putrid mesh of textures and reeked horribly. I spat it out on the floor and gagged. I would have thrown up if I had anything in my stomach. I hadn't eaten anything since I had gotten on the ship, seemingly days ago. I opened my eyes to see what I had accidentally ingested. And without getting too graphic, let's say I found a crew member, and he's been decomposing for a while. Staring at the slop on the ground, I had one thought. It was no longer sneaking around to escape and let this off the hook. I was gonna kill that fucking thing. I continued laying here thinking of my plan. If I blow this ship, I can at least imprison this thing at the bottom of the sea where it belongs. I thought of my tools. I brought a knife, a water bottle, and a flashlight. Woefully unprepared for this trip. I got up and wobbly walked to the bunks to search the lockers. I found what was probably the engineer's stuff, and had a small tool bag in it. I grabbed it and walked up to the engine room. I was getting more stable and clearer by the second. My anger towards this evil now is what kept me warm, what kept me going. I was fueled by rage instead of food. It was as if I too benefited off the hate and darkness, like most creatures do. When I reached the door, I found the same flickering light at the end of the same dim hallway, rumbling the entire time. However, there was one thing out of place. In that flickering light, standing a couple dozen meters away, was the pure black entity I had yet to see so still. It was a silhouette of myself in many ways, and I think it planned it that way. Just another tool in its bag of torture. I knew it was looking at me, even if there was no distinguishing between the front and back from that distance. It was just all blackness anyway. I opened the door, no hiding from it now. I reached into the tool bag and picked up a large wrench and began running at it. It ran back, and as much as I'd like to say if it was a good fight, it wasn't. It couldn't even hit the thing. I swung straight through its skull, and nothing. It was as if I hit thin air. That was when I knew it was going to be bad. It hit hard though, throwing me straight against some pipes and bursting a few. When the pipes burst, I saw that that's where its attention went. I guess I was right in assuming it wants the ship intact. I got up to my feet as fast as I could, but it was no use. It was quick, and to feel another bludgeon against the side of my head, I was spitting up blood. But it was nothing for what was to come. It picked me up by the top of my head and held its hand in front of me. Instead of it looking like a normal hand, it changed to more akin to a handsaw. It began sawing away slowly at my throat, ever so slightly ripping into more and more flesh with each successive swipe. This was agony. As I felt each and every nick, I felt warm flow from my body only for a few moments. As the blood flew from my neck, it covered my shirt, and then the cool air matched the cold touch of evil that will always come with the feeling of bleeding out. It let me go, and I fell to the ground with a lifeless thud. I practically was, but maybe if he thought I was good as dead, it would just leave me alone. And that's just what it did. I had no time. I held my neck and reached out for anything to save me, and it came in the place of a third-degree burn to my palm. It must have been one of the exhaust pipes, and I managed to wiggle over and cauterize the wound before passing out. I woke up sometime later. It was yet again another miracle I was alive. I just laid alone in the dark of the engine room. I didn't feel the presence close by, and so I sat up. I had so little left in me. I grabbed the wrench and found the connector to the exhaust. I began to loosen the bolts. I had managed to remove the connection and was now spewing fumes into the engine bay, with a rush of extreme heat. I backed away and grabbed the water bottle out of my bag. It was luckily still frozen, and thinking of one last goodbye of this hellhole, I threw the bottle into the pipe and ran. The temperature differences caused a small explosion, blowing up a large chunk of piping. Alarms began to ring out. Red lights flashed, and a horrible screech filled this metal coffin. I think this beast felt that. I made it to the main ladder, and before I began my ascent, I looked back at the engine door one last time. You could see fire starting to build, pouring out. but standing in the center of the doorway was that black silhouette, distorted from the anger at the sight of me alive. I could tell it was deciding whether to kill me and let its ship be destroyed, or vice versa. With a snarl, it turned and entered the room, being engulfed by flames. I climbed the ladder, and as the hatch opened when we tried it, I felt freedom. Maybe this thing didn't have the power to save the ship and keep me imprisoned. Anyway, it didn't matter as I was out. I opened the door and was welcomed by a sky full of stars staring back at me. My ship just floating alongside, just as I had left it. I struggled to my ship and set sail away from the hidden base. I don't know how long I slept for, but it was at least several days, as I found myself close to the coast of North America. I don't know whether I killed it entirely or not. We seemed to have left each other for another day, deciding to save ourselves instead of killing each other. I guess it's what I would prefer humans do now that I think about it. I feel better now, as I just had some time to heal. I will continue my adventures seeking out the paranormal. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Stay vigilant. There are dark forces among us.